Tim's talk today with the Intercultural Communication Through Performance research group. And so on behalf of my colleague Professor Amanda Bailey, who unfortunately couldn't be here, but who is a convener of that research group, and myself, I'd like to bid you welcome. And I have to say, it's a great thrill for me to have Tim here at Advanced SPA. His work has been inspirational in a number of the fields of the environmental humanities over several decades, in certainly environmental anthropology, but also human geography, cultural geography, my own field of ecological aesthetics within environmental literary studies, and I'm sure other areas as well. And so I'm delighted to now introduce my colleague Ellie Nixon, who is the Director of Field for the BA in Acting, and who is going to introduce Tim on behalf of the Intercultural Communication Through Performance Research Group. Thank you, Ellie.
Welcome, everybody. I'm delighted to introduce Tim Ingold, Professor of Social Anthropology at the University of Aberdeen and a Fellow of the British Academy and the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Tim has carried out ethnographic fieldwork among Sami and Finnish people in Lapland and has written on environment technology and social organisation in the circumpolar north, as well as on animals and human society, issues in human ecology, and evolutionary theory in anthropology, biology and history. In more recent research, Tim has followed 3 lines of inquiry that emerged from earlier work concerning the dynamics of pedestrian movement, the creativity of practice, and the linearity of writing. He now writes and teaches on the interface between anthropology, archaeology, art and architecture, and directs the project Knowing from the Inside, Anthropology, Art, Architecture and Design, or for short, KFI. This is a 5-year project funded by a European Research Council advanced grant. It started in 2013 and is about to end, and that's where I met Tim. He very kindly invited me to a KFI symposium last summer, and really looking forward to Tim's lecture, which is titled Noise, Sound, Silence.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for such a warm welcome, and it's a beautiful place and a lovely day. So here we are. So who can define what noise is? It's a word that points to the sheer impossibility of definition. If anything is something, then it's not noise. If it's somewhere, it's not noise. If it's intelligible, it's not noise. And in all these ways, noise appears to be the sensory equivalent of dirt, where dirt, as anthropologists say, is matter out of place. Noise is sense out of place, or in a word, nonsense. It's a manifestation of the disorder of the world, of its entropic tendencies. And since noise is indefinable, it cannot define. It pays no respect to categorical boundaries. It makes concentration hard, focus impossible. It rocks the foundations of existence, condemning us to ride the ocean of sensation like landlubbers on the deck of a ship, heaving every which way in the swell. Indeed, it's from the Latin nausea, with its reference to seasickness, that our word noise is derived. And yet, precisely because of its formlessness, noise harbours an unlimited creative potential. Every cycle of life starts in noise, even if it ends in silence. So between life and death, noise and silence, lies everything of form and significance. In his Principles of Psychology, William James famously wrote that the baby, assailed by eyes, ears, nose, skin, and entrails at once, feels it all as one great blooming, buzzing confusion. And if that's noise, then it's not limited to the auditory realm, but covers every possible way in which the world is present to the senses. But in what follows, I want to limit myself to the buzz of auditory sensation, though not without comparison to the bloom of the visual. And my question is this: if we begin in noise and end in silence, then how can they be distinguished? Or are they just the same? Do we end in life where we began? The paradox of noise is that it can be deafening. When noise is at its most intense, it is quite impossible to hear anything. Yet, when nothing is audible, isn't that silence? So both noise and silence, it seems, are experiences of hearing nothing. But hearing something, that surely is an experience of sound. So are noise and silence two extremes of a continuum between which lie every shade and intensity of sound? And if so, then how are we to tell them apart? It doesn't help to say that noise is, well, noisy, or that silence is silent. Posed thus in the field of oral perception, this conundrum has its counterpart in the field of visual perception in the question of how to tell day from night. Absolute silence is often compared to the blackness of the night, when it's pitch dark with neither moon and stars, nor any artificial light for illumination. You cannot see anything. All around you and in your head is black. But light can be blinding, just as noise can be deafening. And the more blinding the light, or the more deafening the noise, the more it inclines to white. So the counterpart of white noise is the white out of a snowstorm, or thick fog, in which daylight visibility is reduced virtually to zero. So both the black of the blackout and the white of the whiteout are experiences of seeing nothing. In between, every shade and intensity of light affords an experience of seeing something. So what is the difference between black and white? And resolving this conundrum takes us to the heart of the problem of what we mean by light and sound. And that's really what I want to get at. So let's start with light. No one seems to be able to say what it is. Physics tells us that light is an energetic impulse radiating from a source as waves or photons. But if that's so, then despite the name optics having been assigned to the physics of light, we have no need of eyes for light to exist. All that's needed is a source. Nor even do eyes enable their bearers to see the light. What they see are things in the light. According to the ecological theory of visual perception proposed by psychologist James Gibson, what matters for vision is not the light itself, but the patterning that comes from the ways its rays are refracted and reflected by surfaces in the world. The continuous modulation of these patterns as they're picked up by a moving observer is sufficient to specify the features of the environment that we actually see. When in our experience we see nothing, it's because for one reason or another, the patterning has been eradicated. This could be because the light source has been occluded, as the sun is at night, or because the rays of light have been diffracted at random by particles of moisture in the atmosphere, as in a fog, with the result that any differentiation in the ambient light that might have specified environmental information has been dissolved. And in this respect, as Gibson himself observes, there is nothing to distinguish ambient light from ambient darkness. Either way, we see not something, but nothing, pure emptiness. And it's just the same with sound. Physicists explain that sound is a mechanical vibration in the medium set off by some initial disturbance, maybe the impact of one object or another on another, or the friction of materials in movement, and emitted in all directions from the source. So in this sense, the physicist's sense, sound has no more need of ears for its existence than light has need of eyes, and acoustics is as much a misnomer for the physics of sound as optics is a misnomer for the physics of light. So what do we hear? If we apply the same logic to oral perception as we've just applied to vision, then we arrive at a conclusion that is both surprising and counterintuitive. It is that the last thing we hear is sound itself. What we actually hear, and commonly mistake for sound, are patterns or invariants in the sonic media whose modulations allow us to identify events or properties of the environment. So when asked to report on what we hear, we tell not of the sounds themselves, but of the objects and events that they bring to our attention. A dog barking, a door slamming, a car passing. And when we report that we hear nothing, not even the dog, the door, or the car, it's because there is no discernible pattern in the acoustic signal. And this could be because the signal has faded out or been occluded by a barrier, or because it's been completely scrambled by interference. White noise, as the cultural historian Hillel Schwartz tells us, white noise is patternless sound, rather than an olla of all sounds. So, in their effects, black silence and white noise are no difference. Either way, nothing is heard. So with hearing as with vision, it seems there is no telling black from white. And yet, manifestly, we can tell the difference. The contrast between being blinded by light and cast into darkness is palpable, even though in neither case can we see anything. And so is the contrast between being deafened by noise and being cocooned in hermetic silence, even though, again, in neither case can anything be heard. So what is the light that blinds and the noise that deafens? They can't be the energetic impulses to which the physicists refer, because the light ray only gets as far as the retina, and the sonic vibration only gets as far as the eardrum. So might their sources rather lie within? Could the eyes and the ears be sites not for the reception, respectively, of light and noise, but for their generation? If the senses are like keyboards, might the player be inside the piano? Much attention has been paid to the study of so-called entoptic phenomena, such as the zigzag streaks of light that presage an attack of migraine, or the floaters that dart about in the eye when you're tired, invading the field of vision. That the eyes do have their own lights can be confirmed merely by closing them for a moment and concentrating on the darkness of a field which you'll find to be lit up by specks as innumerable as stars in the night sky. They have their counterparts in the repertoire of buzzing, hissing and clicking noises that torment sufferers from tinnitus. And all of us experience these noises to a degree, even though for most of the time they remain in the background. And as the composer John Cage repeatedly observed, total silence is impossible as long as the blood of the body keeps circulating and nerves remain on edge. Now, clearly, closing one's eyes on a summer's day will not stop the sun from emitting radiation, nor will stopping one's ears quell the vibrations set off by an explosion. Light and sound in their physical definitions remain real and present even if you shut yourself off from their sensory impact. So in these terms, the dazzle you experience behind closed eyes, even in the absence of external light, and the buzz of nerves inside your head, even in the absence of external sound, can be no more than visual or auditory hallucinations. Or to suggest otherwise, say the physicists, is at best to be carried away by colourful analogy and at worst to peddle in illusion. Perhaps the dazzle and the buzz are internal effects that mimic the effects of exposure to external luminary or sonic stimuli, but they're not light or sound in themselves. But if, on the other hand, we allow that our dazzled eyes and buzzing ears do indeed fill our heads with light and sound, and that there's no escaping from either, even in a dark room or anechoic chamber, then evidently the physics will not help us. So could psychology offer an alternative? Are light and sound inside the head rather than out there in the world? Are they affectations of the mind? Well, if that's so, then light is light and sound is sound, whether or not it can be attributed to an external source. So the bang that I hear is a bang in the head, regardless of any explosion that may have taken place, if at all, in the world. Now, classical psychology imagines that an impervious boundary separates mind and world and mediates all exchanges between them. And that boundary is the body, including its sensory organs such as eyes and ears, as well as the touch-sensitive envelope of skin. On the outside, the body is energetically buffeted by photoelectric radiation and by vibrations in the medium. On the inside, it experiences light and sound. But this is a separation that is belied by experience. We are inhabitants not of our bodies, but as it seems to us, of a world. The body with its organs of sense affords an opening to this world, not a means of separation from it. That is, it offers exposure, not immunity. Light and sound, then, are neither in here nor out there, neither mental nor physical. On the contrary, the very experience of light or of sound is one in which the boundary is dissolved, in which mind and world, the sensing and the sensible, fuse together, and in so doing constitute a field of perception. Or as the philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty put it, light and sound present themselves as kinds of symbiosis, certain ways the outside has of invading us, and certain ways we have of meeting this invasion. The symbiosis, if you will, is of the affective and the cosmic. And wherever the two collide, that is where our attention is let loose upon the world, there is ignited a kind of spark. And herein, says Merleau-Ponty, lies the continual birth of our visual awareness, that is, of light itself. But he could have said just the same of sound. So let's return to William James and the newborn baby, assailed, as he says, by blooming, buzzing confusion. Opening its eyes upon the world for the first time, the baby recognizes nothing. The first time we see light, wrote James, we are it rather than see it. And struck blind from that moment, the baby nevertheless knows something that his elders, recognizing everything they see around them, have long forgotten. A sense of what light really is in its first incarnation. Not until we find ourselves lost in a whiteout, rekindling the experience of that first opening, does the memory return. So could it be the same with sound? The baby is immersed in sound long before being exposed to light, because its auditory awareness has already developed in the bubbling, thumping and gurgling environment of the womb. It's dark in there, but very, very noisy. So perhaps in the experience of the unborn child, sound is not what she hears, but what she is, until that moment of birth when she becomes a being of the light as well. Of course, we were all there once, and while we can only speculate as to what it must have been like, it seems that the primordial memory of sound has not been eradicated in the minds of modern people to the extent that we have lost the memory of light. And the difference shows up in the radical distinction that is commonly drawn in so-called Western societies between vision and hearing. We see things, it is said, but we hear sounds. Why is that? Why should the objects of vision appear broken off from the light that renders them visible to us, whereas the things we hear seem to be sculpted from the very stuff of sound itself? Now, according to a widely held view, Vision sets things at a distance in their proper places, and looking is a targeted act of perception. In their verb skopijn, meaning to look, the ancient Greeks compared it to shooting an arrow. But hearing, we are told, is immersive. It takes sound in, gathering it from every direction and concentrating it at the very core of our awareness. We find ourselves not set apart, but at the centre of our auditory world. Now, to this one could of course object that listening to things can be just as targeted as looking at them. Indeed, the one assists the other, because in swivelling the head to balance the auditory input from the source, our eyes are precisely oriented in its direction, helping to pick it out. So we hear a bird singing in the tree, to balance the auditory input, we turn our head and there our eyes are targeted straight towards it, and we have a chance of seeing it as well. And conversely, the luminous experience of a whiteout can be just as immersive as that of all-around noise, just as constitutive of our existence as sentient beings. So it seems that in their eagerness to contrast vision and hearing, scholars have inadvertently chosen to foreground targeted perception in the case of vision and immersive experience in the case of hearing. And that is hardly to compare like with like. Indeed, the alleged contrast between hearing and vision seems to have been introduced as a surrogate for a distinction of more fundamental ontological consequence, that is, between the nascent experience of a world in constant becoming, as if it were undergoing continuous birth, in which things are ever on the point of emerging from the fluxes of their generation, and the retrospective review of a world of being in which everything has already precipitated out and has fallen where it will, in this position or that. So each time I identify a thing with its sound, I'm reminded of the work it takes to differentiate both myself as a hearer and the thing heard from the continuum in which we were both primordially immersed. The thing has to be made out, and in so doing I make myself out as well, fashioning a self in the very act of hearing. Wrapped up in the sound of the thing is the memory of its once having been dissolved in an ocean of vibrant materials. And wrapped up in my hearing it is the memory of having been flooded by noise even before I was born. In hearing, my auditory awareness remains saturated with the medium whence it emerged, as is the thing heard. So the puzzle is why we, modern people, should have come to think so differently about vision. Why it is that when we use our eyes rather than our ears, we should think of ourselves as already completed beings, and of the world as one in which everything has fallen finally into place. It seems that as vision has been co-opted to serve the ends of the modern project of objectification, we have forgotten how things are not just there to be seen, but have themselves to be made out from mist or darkness as sculptures of light and shadow. And so we say of a thing or a matter that it appears as though the it were already there and waiting to be revealed to our prying eyes, while oblivious to the appearing that must be done to bring it forth. To say appears it, as the philosopher Henri Bortoft remarks, to say appears it might be grammatically aberrant, but it is better philosophically. So perhaps this co-option of vision to the project of objectification has something to do with the translucence of glass, the ubiquity of mirrors, and the conquest of the dark by electric light. As a material, glass is not naturally translucent, and it's taken a massive technological effort to develop procedures to make it so. And this effort has been driven by an ideal of perfection according to which the truth of things is to be seen objectively as through a window, yet without distortion. Perfectly translucent glass both separates us from the object of perception, while yet affording a correct and complete picture. And if glass completes the world as its picture, the mirror completes the self in its own image. We don't need others in whose eyes we can fashion ourselves, when the mirror, as Peter Sloterdijk has it, already provides technical means of self-completion. And finally, with electric light, things emerge from the shadows as fully formed objects in their own right, given independently of their illumination. But throughout the greater part of human history, illumination through the long hours of darkness came only from the light of the lamp or the fire. Glass, if used at all, was uneven and partially opaque, while only the waters of a clear pool could offer reflection. Things looked differently then. The Japanese novelist Junichiro Tanizaki, in his classic essay In Praise of Shadows, describes how traditional lacquerware, finished in dark shades of black, brown, or red, but decorated with flecks of silver and gold, would come into its own in a room lit not by the sun or by electricity, but by a single lantern or candle. Dull and garish by day, in the lamplight of an evening, the lacquerware would glow. It was made to be seen in the dark. So when we make out sounds from silence, are we not doing something very similar to Tanizaki when he admires lacquerware by candlelight? In the flickering flame, the ware emerges from the shadows. It is appeared. It is made out. So perhaps we should compare sound to a flame. Now, there are two ways of describing a flame, and in drawings they're often combined. I'll just do one. This is the sort of thing you get on Christmas cards, where you have a candle. So here's a candle, a wick, and the flame drawn as a curly thing like this. There's the thing inside. But then sometimes we might add the rays. So there's these things coming off like this, in a straight line. Maybe illuminating walls or curtains that they're falling on. So that's how we would conventionally draw a candle. So the flame is drawn with these curvy lines that rise up from the wick, but in no determinate direction. It's just basically going upwards, but they're swirling a bit. And this convention conveys a sense of the liveliness of an apparition that exists only in the process of combustion. But fanning out in all directions from a point at the center of the flame, we draw another set of lines, and these are, in theory, absolutely straight and oriented. So in the world this drawing depicts, although we can see the flame, none of those lines going out, they can't be seen. You can see the flame, but you can't see the rays, the lines that are going out. But what they're meant to indicate is rays that, invisible in themselves, render visible the surfaces on which they fall. And we follow the same convention when we draw the sun as a circle with lines coming out like spokes from the hub of a wheel, or stars as figures with points. So when we draw, say, here's the sun, have these lines coming out. It's the same convention. So then, the question is, looking at that picture of the candle, which of these is light, the flame or the rays? Right? Is this the light? Or is this the light? Which one? Physics would say it's the rays. It radiates in straight lines from a source. But experience tells us otherwise, that light can be seen as plainly as the candle flame, that it does not travel, that light does not travel in straight lines, but curls up and around, much like the smoke of a fire, but along a path orthogonal to the radii that connect the centre of the flame to all points on the periphery. So this simple drawing of a candle reveals two quite different ways of thinking about lines of light. There are lines of emission, and we can call them rays. But there are also lines of combustion. So by what term, that's the flame, by what term should these lines be known? I'm going to call them beams. So this is a ray, this one here, this here, that's a beam. I'm making a distinction between beams of light and rays of light. Now nowadays we tend to equate beams and rays. It's a ray of light, beam of light, so it's the same thing. And we think of them like beams of milled timber that give structural support to buildings. We think of them essentially rectilinear, straight. A projector, like that thing up there, is otherwise known as a beamer. Spotlights and lasers cast beams that can sometimes seem to strafe the sky with intersecting lines. And it has been supposed that the beam entered the vernacular of English as a translation from the Latin radio solis, literally spoke of the sun. But it turns out that this derivation is incorrect. In fact, the luminous beam first appears in Anglo-Saxon sources as the biblical columna lucis, the pillar of light, by which in the book of Exodus the Israelites were guided on their way at night. And as such, it is comparable not to straight-cut timber, but to the trunk of the living tree rising up from the earth. And though otherwise obsolete, this is a comparison that survives in the common names of tree species such as white beam and hornbeam, and it was once much more general. A beam would be a tree trunk rising from the ground. So it's no wonder that the Venerable Bede, writing in the 8th century, used the same word, beam, to describe the column of light or fire rising from the body of a saint. For Bede, as the tree trunk grows from the earth, so light beams from the saintly body as a great flame. And like the trunk, the luminous beam is not straight, not at least perfectly straight, but twists and turns in response to atmospheric conditions. The beam, in short, is a line not of emission, but of combustion, and it's in that sense that I'll use the term. But then, what could be its sonic counterpart? And I want to nominate for the counterpart the word pitch. Pitch, coincidentally, refers to the black oozy substance released from the roots of a pine tree after it has been fired. But it's another of the word's multiple senses that I adopt here. To pitch, among other things, is to cast, to toss, or to throw, as in cricket pitch. As the tree grows, and as flames rise from the pyre, so in the ongoing collision of cosmos and affect, sound erupts into the atmosphere formed of their unison. So once again, a clear distinction has to be made between the line of emission, connecting a source and a recipient, by which sound is generally known to physics, and the line of eruption, which describes the trajectory of sound as it unfolds in experience. The latter is what I'm calling its pitch. Imagine, for example, the sound of a siren, of the kind that in times of war warns of an impending air raid. It's produced by blowing air with a fan through an apparatus consisting of a rapidly rotating disc within a static cylinder. Both the disc and the cylinder are punctured with holes that, as they come in and out of alignment, alternately block and release the airflow so as to generate vibrations of greater or lesser frequency depending on the speed of rotation. That's how a siren works. And these vibrations, conducted through the medium of air, eventually impinge on your ears, maybe some seconds or even minutes later, depending on the distance. And on a diagram, you could draw a straight line from the generator to ears, measure the distance, and calculate the time it takes for the auditory signal to traverse it. So you could draw a simple diagram like this. You say, well, here's the siren. I don't know how to draw it, but anyway, there it is. Here's your ear, and measure the distance, and it's going to take however many seconds to traverse that distance. But that line I just drew, that horizontal line there, is not the same as the pitch line of the sound itself as you experience it. Because this latter is a line that corresponds with the stretch of your own oral attention as it opens up upon the world. You'd probably describe it as having no determinate start or end point, but as a kind of rising and swelling, holding for a while at peak level and then falling and trailing away. I mean, imagine an air raid siren. You start, it just grows into your consciousness. It's coming out of nothing, and then it's going, and then it holds up for a period of time, and it kind of trails off again. So you draw it something like that. If somebody asks you to draw the sound of the siren, you probably do a graph, something of that kind. Now that line describes the trajectory of experienced experienced sound, and the time it takes is the real-time duration of the siren's wave. It goes on for 2 minutes or whatever it is. So we don't make any mistake in identifying the wail as a sound rather than as a pattern in the sound. The generator, after all, produces nothing except aerial vibrations. The mistake is rather to confuse the experience of sound, that is its pitch, with the mechanical signals that, along with a well-functioning auditory system, are among the conditions for that experience to occur. And this will be the precise equivalent in the field of oral perception of confusing the beam and the ray in the field of vision. So the wail of the siren, that thing, is the analogue of the flame of the candle. And as the flame is a beam of light, the wail is a pitch of sound. Both, in our experience, are entirely real. And yet here's the catch, because neither the flame nor the siren is truly an object of perception. To observe the candle is to see by candlelight. To listen to the siren is to hear by its wail. So with both vision and hearing, as Merleau-Ponty pointed out in posthumously published notes, with both vision and hearing, what captures our attention has a way of coiling over so as to inflect the very process of attending. So it follows that light and sound are at once on the far side and on the hither side of vision and hearing, respectively. They're not out there rather than in here, but they're both out this side and the other side. What I see conditions my own way of seeing. What I hear conditions my own way of hearing. Recall that for Merleau-Ponty, light and sound are neither in here in the head, nor out there in the world, neither mental nor physical, but experiential and atmospheric. So it's at the very moment when the somatic boundaries between inside and outside dissolve, allowing the space of affect to fill the cosmos, and reciprocally to be filled by it, that light ignites and sound erupts into our awareness. So then what happens to the eyes and the ears? Anatomically speaking, eyes and the ears are organs firmly cemented in place at the front and sides of the head, primed to receive and respond to photoelectric and vibratory stimuli. But when I open my eyes and ears to the world, when I look, listen, and attend, it seems to me that my head has disappeared. However, my eyes and ears have not. They've rather expanded to pervade the entirety of visual and acoustic space, within which my whole existence is now enveloped. I am, as we say colloquially, all eyes and all ears. I'm really pretending. Sure, I can tap with my fingers and confirm that head is still there. I can't see it. Definitely head. But in the experience of light and sound, where my head is, there's the world. So if I look out, I can see that my sweater sort of ends, and then suddenly there's the world. The world where my head ought to be is all that's the point. My head has actually disappeared at that point. So from being a body with eyes, it seems that I am becoming eye body. From being a body with ears, I'm becoming ear body. And an ear body, and here I'm quoting from the sound performance artist Fabrizio Manco, an ear body is an inclination to untie and to realize this radical openness, not only through the anatomical hearing ear, but also by becoming one. But then, how is it possible to become ear, as Manco says? Well, for the body to become ear, the whole body to be sort of one great ear, it has first to be decomposed anatomically in order that it can then be reconstructed as something like a bundle of affects. This isn't a surgical operation, of course, but a switch of perspective from acoustics to the phenomenology of auditory perception, or in other words, from objectification to experience. The ears, and for that matter the eyes as well, are thenceforth no longer the organs of a body, but the affective dispositions of what Deleuze and Guattari call a body without organs. So the question of navigation is one of how such a body can find its way around. And according to Manco, Fabrizio Manco, the ear body achieves this by tracing what he calls ear lines. If the cast of sound is its pitch, the ear line is the stretch of attention that follows pitch like an elastic thread. The line can be inscribed on paper by drawing or on the ground by walking, but the stretch itself is aerial. So to get a sense of it, you could take a sheet of paper, here's a sheet of paper, crumple it up into a tight ball like this, and then spread it out again. This is something rather beautiful. You just open this up, and you get this beautifully ruffled surface full of valleys and hills, and it's like a wonderfully complicated landscape in which different parts are casting micro shadows on the other. It's a rather remarkable thing. And what you get is a dense and irregular mesh of folds and creases that, not unlike the surface of the ocean, ruffled by wind. And it's characteristic of folds and creases that they emerge from the surfaces in which they are formed, but never part from them. Where the paper or the ocean is crumpled on the surface, then the air is also crumpled in its volume. And this crumpledness of aerial volume is tantamount to its noise. And within it, every crease, every fold, affords a line that can potentially be followed. So just like the crease in the paper or the ruffle in the sea surface, the line is in the noise and never actually parts from it. And this has an important corollary, namely that tracing an ear line is an effort of continuous differentiation. The theatre scholar George Hume Cook, in his book on oral attention, describes thus his efforts to hear himself think against the background noise of children playing next door. He says, "It is to listen out intently for my thoughts as they momentarily and haphazardly pop into view within this sonic barrage. So what is this listening out? It's not about search and retrieval. To hear something rather than nothing is not to come away with some material substance or with an object found. But nor should it imply that sound is immaterial. It's rather immaterial, just as grain, for example, is in wood, crease is in sheet, and path is in ground. Ear lines are traced in the grains, creases, and pathways of crumpled noise. They are no more and no less than lines of difference. So to hear something is always to cut a fine line between the indifference of silence and of noise, or what Deleuze has called black nothingness and white nothingness. And I've referred to this process of cutting from within, quite generally, as one of interstitial differentiation, differentiating out from the inside. And by this I mean to oppose it to the external accretion by which assemblies are formed from initially discrete and self-contained elements. It may be that the energetic sources of sound can be added one to another, as were the voices of neighbouring children for Hume Cook. But to attend to any particular sound or voice is not to set it apart by subtraction, but to cut along its line as the carpenter cuts along the grain, the seamstress along the crease, or the walker along the path. And that brings me back at length to the question with which I began. How can we tell noise from silence, or white from black? With a clearer understanding of what sound is, we do have some hope of answering the question. And we can do so by returning to the comparison with light, but this time with regard to a phenomenon of experience that I've not yet touched on, and that is colour. Now, many people, gifted with synesthetic sensibility, will readily associate colour with the quality of experienced sound, which is generally known as its timbre. Indeed, the association is so well established that in the German language, for example, the word for timbre, which is Klangfarbe, literally means sound colour. And the philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy has observed that there is, quote, no pitch without timbre, just as there is no line or surface without colour. So the analogy is quite explicit here. So how come that not only can pitch be specified in the notational conventions of classical music on the stave score quite independently of timbre, but also that the surface, which more than any other is iconic of modernity, namely the transparent pane, mirror or screen, is perfectly colourless. Pitch, it seems, has been abstracted from the cast of sound, and colour has been abstracted from illumination, only to be aligned on a scale of quantitative variation, which allows the properties of energetic emissions to be objectively specified without regard to the qualities or intensities of sonorous or luminous experience induced in those with eyes to see or ears to hear. In effect, both pitch and colour have been spectralized, the one laid out on a spectrum of vibrational frequencies, the other on a spectrum of wavelengths. Now, analysts have struggled to find terms, including things like brightness, saturation, and value, to capture the ordinal qualities of light that are left once colour has been siphoned off. But none exhaust the inherent lustre of, say, Japanese lacquerware. Nor can their equivalents in the analysis of sound, such as amplitude or tone, exhaust the qualities of timbre. And at the root of the problem, I think, is the elision of being with ray, in the case of light, and in the case of sound, of the line of pitch, with the line of emission. At the turn of the 18th century, it caused Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, scientist, poet, and pioneer of Romanticism, to launch a celebrated attack on the mechanical optics of Isaac Newton. For Newton, mathematician and physicist to the core, light meant rays. End of story. That's what light was. And rays, when differentially refracted by means of a prism, would yield up all the colours of the rainbow from red to violet. And recombined, they would merge into colourless white. Colour then, for Newton, was strictly a property of rays, and as such was given quite independently of our experience of it. But Goethe, as we know, would have none of this. For him, light was a phenomenon of experience, that is, an affective intermingling of our own awareness with the turbulence and pulsations of the medium. For Goethe, it was the flame of the candle, not its rays, and it lit up the world as do the flames of a fire in the combustion of materials. As with the blaze of a wood fire, light at its most intense is white, grading through yellow, red and blue to the black of cold charcoal, or of the pitch that oozes from charred roots. So for Goethe, light acts on matter as fire on wood, generating all the colours in the process on a scale not from red to violet, but from white to black. Now this is a scale not of quantitative variation, as would nowadays be measured in terms of wavelength, but a qualitative scale of affective intensity. You could say of degrees of difference, rather than differences of degree. And only on such a scale can we register the contrast between black and white, or distinguish darker colours from lighter ones. This is why Gibson, as you'll remember, had such a problem with light and darkness. If you see, as he said, not light itself, but only patterns in the light, then how can you tell day from night? The shifting shadows cast by the sun in its diurnal traverse of the sky give us information about the features on which the light falls, which at night might be picked out in the moonlight or by the beam of a torch. But how can we account for the difference between the experience of sunlight, of moonlight, and of torchlight? Now, Gibson himself attempted to deal with the problem by distinguishing, very problematically, distinguishing between chromatic colour, by which he meant the hues of the spectrum, and achromatic colour, by which he meant variation from black through grey to white. Achromatic colour is kind of colourless colour. It's a very contradictory notion. Ecologically speaking, Gibson argued, patterns of chromatic colour are picked up along with other visual information specifying the invariant properties of surface texture in the environment. But achromatic colour, this colourless colour, remained an enigma, as did the colour of firelight. Considered ecologically, Gibson tells us, well, this is a quote, a fire with flames, as you can see he's struggling here, a fire with flames consists of complex motions and deformations, which bring about modulations in the surface texture of the burning material and ultimately reduces solid surfaces to ash. Well, to be sure, in the course of its fiery transformation, the material changes colour, and this is ecologically relevant. So he's talking about this, the material of wood eventually turning to ash. Okay, but what's happened to the flames? The fire burns, we observe the way in which the wood changes from being dark to red to yellow to the white of the ash, but the flames, in our perception, have gone out. Now what goes for colour also goes for pitch, and the problem is the same. Just as Gibson distinguished chromatic and achromatic colour, we could, if we want, likewise distinguish pitched pitch from pitchless pitch. But the results would be equally paradoxical. Pitched pitch would be the counterpart of spectral hue and would vary from high to low depending on the vibrational frequency of the signal. Patterns of pitched pitch, picked up by the moving and attentive observer, could reveal relevant objects and events in the environment, and we could use these patterns to find our way around. But pitchless pitch, the cast of sound itself, remains unaccounted for. Of course, we have a word for it, namely timbre. But an acoustics that remains limited to the detection of invariance in pitch patterns has no place for the experience of timbre. The wail of the siren, the clang of the bell, the honk of the horn, the buzz of the insect, the whoosh of the wind, the thump of the beating heart, all these sounds which have inspired such a rich vein of onomatopoeia would be lost to perception. Each would be the sonic equivalent of the vanishing flame or beam. So what's the solution? The solution is to undo the division between pitch and timbre, to bring them together again into the fullness of phenomenal experience. And this is the precise equivalent in the field of sound of the reunison of colour and lustre in the field of light. Only then can we understand how in life we are consumed by noise as wood is by fire, and how, starting from the blooming, buzzing confusion of the womb and following with our ear lines along the ways of the world, we end up with the silence from which, like the number 0, everything comes. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Tim, for this eloquent, erudite, and really intriguing meditation on the phenomena of sound and its relationship with vision. I was particularly delighted to hear you recalling Goethe's wonderful phenomenology of colour. And another romantic voice that could have been brought into this conversation is Wordsworth's, when he calls his poetic speaker calls upon his bookish friend to come forth into the light of things and bring with you a heart that welcomes and receives a kind of affective and affectionate response to the kind of inner radiance of things rather than the way that they're illuminated from outside. Great stuff. Now, we've got lots of time for questions and comments. While you're gathering your thoughts, I will just draw your attention to our next Environmental Humanities event, which is on the 18th of April. And it's a public forum on performing environments. And one of our speakers is Ellie. And another is Thomas Kamper at Fastfire. And we have a wonderful visiting performance artist, Tiago Gambogi, who'll be talking about his pretty confronting and powerful sort of eco-political performance art. That's on the 18th of April in the Hoban Museum, so you'll find more information about that on our website. And then in May, we have Ian, who's actually here with us, will be actually doing a kind of a performance, a performative presentation with a poet. So it's an art and literature performative presentation called Crow Road. So both of those events are on our website. But now over to you for questions and comments.
When you were talking, I was just thinking about how our perception of light and sound might differ because of the speed that they travel in.
You mean, yeah, well, because light is, in that sense, in the physicist sense, light is travelling very, very fast, and sound is travelling relatively slowly, and you can get these disjunctions, like when you're listening to an orchestra playing and you're some distance away, and you see the musicians play, and the sound seems to come, so it's all a bit out of sync. So in that sense, the experience can come in. But as soon as you talk about the speed of light or the speed of sound, you're already taking light and sound in the specific physicist sense as an energetic emission from a source to a recipient, and you're thinking of something travelling through the medium. And my argument would be that that's not in itself what you experience. The experience of light and the experience of sound is something different. That's why I think the different speeds would or could register an experience when you're both looking and listening at the same time, and things seem out of joint because of the different speeds. But I don't think it would affect the quality of the experience in itself, which we treated each of them separately.
Yeah. I wondered, it made me think a lot about, I don't know whether you know the Alvin Lucia piece called I Am Sitting in a Room.
No.
It's a kind of recording of a guy sitting in a room saying I'm sitting in a room, and it gradually gets redone, and it's about the spatiality of it. So it made me think about your divisions of inside and outside in a way that we spatialise sound. So that, sounds are foreground sounds are background sounds. And one of the interesting things there is that very young children don't possess the ability to do that. It's very much a learned thing. So when you say to a small child, you're not listening, it's like, no, you're not, because you're just going, sound. It's coming from everywhere. I don't know where it's close. Yeah, and we gradually learn this foreground sound, background sound. So I was thinking about the equivalence there between what you were saying about light and rays and emitting and stuff, and the way we actually use sound to position ourselves. We kind of spatialise our own position.
Which we do, but I wonder, there's a problem here with the we, well, firstly, if this is something that we learn, then there's the question: well, does everybody learn it, or is this something that is something that we're encouraged to learn in a highly spatially aware, spatially partitioned kind of world that we inhabit, and whether we think of the environment in such spatial terms anyway. I would be slightly suspicious that there might be or I would have a hunch that there might be a linkage between this sort of spatialization, which Western kids are undoubtedly taught, you can't deny that, and writing, literacy, because of the way that also encourages us to some sense detach.
Well, it was about that separation, yeah. You're talking about.
And if you imagine you were in a society that had no particular experience of the written word, my guess is that they wouldn't be spatializing themselves and sounding quite the same way. It's just a hunch. It's a rather interesting thing to. Maybe people have investigated it. I don't know.
You see that same process in young children's drawings, though. Where below sort of 7, there's a generalisation. Everything has a similar importance, and it's as they get older where they start to separate out foreground and background. And
yes, but then they're also learning adult conventions according to which what they draw is supposed to be a representation of the world rather than just a
I wonder if they're the same kind
narrative. And then there would be I think you could probably make an argument about this, and it's possible that. You see, the thing that's always puzzled me is why it is that we, meaning here, so let's say Western kids and everything, do make such a radical distinction between vision and hearing. Why we're always saying what you see is objects, people, things, stuff. What you hear is sounds. Why do we do that? Well, how does that apparent asymmetry creep in? Because I don't think that this is universal by any means. And again, writing might have something to do with it. But then also, if you look at the so-called development of children's drawing, the fact that a young child's drawing tends to be validated by an adult in terms of what it's supposed to represent and to what extent it does so, rather than say simply as a narrative or the trace of a gesture, in which what really matters is the child's gesture, not the trace, and there's all sorts of other ways of interpreting it. If it was validated differently, then maybe maybe that difference also relates to this question of differentiating between sound and or hearing and vision. I think that there would be a link somewhere, and it probably has been investigated. But,
the way we hear is probably validated in much the similar way by adults as well.
yeah. Well, I don't know. I don't think that we get the same pressure to say that if a sound is made, that first we say, well, what is that a sound of? That there's not the same separation between the sound and the thing sounding that you get with vision. And so the puzzle for me is why that separation has come in and how. Yeah.
I was thinking about crossing the road.
Mm.
As a child, you tell a child to look and listen to cross the road. And when you were speaking about sound, I remember one of the most terrifying experiences I had was being on a bicycle and going on an underpass in London, and suddenly thinking that cars were coming towards me, that I was actually on the wrong side of the underpass because of the way the sound moved in the underpass. And I thought that I was going to die because cars were going to come at me. And clearly I kept going and realised it was fine, it was just the way the sound had moved. So is there something about urban landscape that when we talk about the room, that we've created an urban landscape in which we've started listening in a very different way? So we teach a child to look and listen to cross the road. So is there something going on there about what that is?
There are a couple of things that struck me there. The first is and it's a really good example to think with, the crossing the road one. The first is that you tell the child to look to the left, look to the right, and then when everything's clear, to cross. The child is not going to remember anything about the cars that went by, what colour they were, what their number plates were, or anything like that. And yet we have a whole lot of visual theories telling us that if your mind has not registered an image, you've not seen anything. So that the child who's actually looking to avoid getting run over is, according to theory, blind. James Elkins has, in one of his books, has said exactly that. I don't know whether he's using that particular example, but he's saying, and I think he's profoundly wrong, that he's saying we are all blind to a degree because we don't remember that a lot of things do not get fixed imagistically in our mind. And therefore, people who really are visually impaired are simply one end of the spectrum. And I think he's really, really wrong about that, because people who are visually impaired really are visually impaired. And it's not just that they're just having a bit more of an affliction than we all have. And the fault lies in this deep-seated notion that to see something means to register an image. And the child crossing the road is a wonderful example of why there is more to vision than the registration of images. But the other thing is that I remember as a child, there was a railway near where I grew up. There was a railway crossing for pedestrians, and a sign up by the line which said, pedestrians stop, look and listen before crossing the line. It was the instruction. And I wrote a paper about this because it struck me as so remarkable that in order to look and listen, the first thing you have to do is to stop. and as though the assumption was that looking and listening was something you did separate from moving. In fact, you could only really look and listen if you stopped moving and started doing the listening. When it was, my argument was that actually you can't look at anything or listen to anything without actually moving yourself, and that it also said something about what actually stopping and starting meant in that context. What does it actually mean to stop doing one thing and start? What does it mean to stop walking and start listening? This is an odd sort of transition. So it does something like that too. But the thing is that again, there's this difference between vision and hearing, that you get these visual theorists saying that you only see something when you register an image, that you don't get oral theorists, maybe aural theorists, saying that you only hear something if you've fixed some kind of sonic image. That the whole way in which people theorize these senses seems to differ. And that's very strange.
Tim, could I just press you a bit further on this? In your capacity as anthropologist, whether you're able to say anything about the different ways in which seeing and hearing are understood, perhaps, and experienced, indeed, in non-kind of modern Western cultures.
One example that I've drawn on in that respect is ethnography from the Inuit. They're living in very wide spaces, open environments, no trees, long distances, and their visual awareness is very acute. So is their hearing, but they don't say that they're seeing objects out there. In fact, very little by way of objects to see. This is the vast expanse, but they're seeing very precisely, so that, for example, it's very important for navigation, that you can make out just the slightest variations in a horizon or something. Tell where you're going. And there was very classic work by an anthropologist called Edmund Carpenter, or more like an ethnographer as well, who was part of the McLuhan gang in Canada, who were convinced that there was this fundamental difference between vision and hearing. And Walter was part of that too, saying that vision is seeing at the distance, you're distancing things, you're objectifying, hearing is putting everything in. And Carpenter was convinced that because the Inuit had no idea that what they were seeing were objects out there, that it was all, it was a sense of immersion, he insisted that their primary engagement with the world was an auditory one. He couldn't contemplate the fact that it could be equally visual, because they weren't using their vision was, as we might say, haptic rather than optical. It was more sort of following things, attuning the movements of one's eyes with, say, birds that you're following in the sky, what it might be, and he couldn't get that. But once we can say that vision doesn't have to be about objectification, it doesn't have to be about spectacle, about setting things in the distance, then it makes perfectly good sense for an Inuit to say that hearing, seeing, well, I don't know, it's all part of the same things about language. I mean, they would be, if you tried pushing them on that and say, well, are you seeing, are you hearing? It's a bit ridiculous. And what do we say, are you looking with one eye or the other? I'm looking with both. You wouldn't really find any sensible way of distinguishing them. And that comes out quite clearly in a lot of the Inuit ethnography, just as an example.
There's an interesting parallel to that, I think, in Indian miniature painting. There's a subset of Indian miniature painting called Raga Mala painting, which is essentially depictions of musical modes. And it's really quite a sophisticated, it's obviously highly conventional, but it's also very sophisticated and very nuanced. Interestingly, the underlying aesthetic is based on something called rasa, which translates literally as taste, taste in the mouth. So there are 7 or 8 basic rasas which are described as distinct tastes, but which we would describe as emotional qualities. So it seems that it's not only a convergence of sight and sound, but it's also got a kind of other dimension as well, which suggests just how differentiated cultural understandings of these things are.
Yes, well, that's a lovely example, but what I worry about is too freely using a term like multisensory, because it's already supposing somehow that you've got these different sensory registers, and then you might be putting them together in different kinds of ways, and well, particularly with vision is a bit sort of special in a way because of the ways the eyes work. But when it comes to taste, smell, touch, and taste, smell, touch, and hearing, they're all. And in a way, it depends on which bit of the body you're pricking. If it happens to your tongue, it's taste. If it happens to your skin, or it's touch. If it happens to on your eardrums, it's hearing. But it's very hard sometimes to see where you could draw the line between them at all. And I do want to avoid the sort of approach that has been represented in anthropological studies of the senses, which have become very fashionable these days, in which it's just said that well, there are different cultures and they value the senses differently. So that these people here are living in a world of a visual world, and these people here are living in an oral world, and these people here are living in a taste world. And I think that's completely well. The trouble with that is that it's not thinking of the senses as I put it as the differences between worlds of sense and sensing the world, and the anthropologists of the senses imagine that people are living in these sensory worlds, which their cultures have constructed for them, rather than actually using their senses to explore their surroundings.
This is a really under-informed bit of kind of, fact-et with possibly no question, but I read very recently, as I was listening to your talk, I was thinking about animal phenomenologies and how they might deal with the kind of auditory and visual, but I read very, very recently that blind people were being taught to use echolocation in the same way that bats do. In that you can kind of see hearingly, and it brings that idea of kind of darkness and location through a non-visual form together. And I just wondered if you'd come across that.
Oh yes, indeed, and blind people will say that they know when, for example, they're near to an obstruction or to a wall or another person, and that they can detect that through. Basically, yes, it is basically echolocation, but the way in which sound is reflecting off different kinds of surfaces and different sorts of textures. There's something I was going to say about that. Or just that, but the thing is that what I've read is that we all do this all the time. It's just that for fully sighted people, we don't pay any sort of attention to it. So you know perfectly well that when you walk into a sitting room that is unfurnished and there are no curtains up or anything, it sounds quite different than if you walk into a furnished room and the curtains are up there. Sound is completely different, and you can tell the difference. And you don't sort of start thinking. You see, oh, there are no curtains, or there are curtains, and you register that difference. And we probably don't pay much attention to the fact that the room here is completely different. But if you didn't have the full use of your sight, then that obviously comes into the foreground. So it's not something special that blind people have that other people don't, but it's something that blind people can use. And there is quite a lot of material on that.
Richard.
Yes, mine's an uninformed question as well, or underinformed question as well, really. But I suppose what I felt I want to ask you is, what are you challenging us to do, or to see or hear, by telling us all this? Because I suppose the nearest thing I have to knowledge in this field comes from new materialist eco-criticism and from biosemiotics. And there, a kind of moral and political impetus has been given to the idea of expanding one's field of perception, particularly to enable one to hear and see things that one previously repressed, or our culture repressed. And I suppose the best known exponent of that approach is David Abraham. And only comparatively recently has there been a certain amount of kickback, I think, in these fields, with a return to the idea that in order that the creation and perception of meaning involves a mixture of apprehension and suppression. That in order to receive one bit of information, you have to block out others. Otherwise, all that will happen is that you will be overwhelmed by too much. And so, identity formation itself, or subjectivity itself, consists of this mixture of, unconsciously selecting and rejecting messages, bits of information, and I guess another question associated with that is the question of the unconscious, and whether there is a sort of repository in which the things that you don't attend to nevertheless get stored in case you are motivated to try to visit them in future, which is a question about memory. So, in a sense, what you're doing seems to me very radical in its demands in some ways. You're asking us to dismantle part of our sensory apparatus in order to allow other information through, I think. And that is sometimes associated with a kind of politics and ethics. And I just wondered what you might say about all that, really.
No, thanks. I broke it down into three parts. The first thing is what am I trying to say, actually? And it's a difficult thing to do. But I actually, this is not primarily a political point or even an ethical one. It's just one about trying to get some sort of precision around issues of what light and sound are. Because I feel that these are being mixed up so much that it's really getting in the way of clear-headed discussion of these issues. And I was really wanting to maybe there is a political or ethical dimension to this. I wanted to say that when people say, for example, that they're listening to music and they say that I heard the sound of music, that's what they really did hear. Because I was fed up with reading literature by psychologists, mostly, who were saying, no, that's not actually the sound. The sound is simply the mechanical vibrations and the effect on their ear, and then your brain has been doing some processing, or whatever particular line they take. They're always saying that the sound itself is what physicists tell us sound is, namely the mechanical vibrations. The rest, depending on your particular theoretical inclination, is something else. It's a pattern that you picked up in the sound, or it's a result of some cognitive processing of the sensory input, whatever it is. Cognitive psychology, ecological psychology will come up with different answers. And I wanted to say, in a way, this was to respect what people themselves will say. That, no, that music that I heard, or that bird singing, or whatever it was, the siren wailing, that was sound. and I wanted to find a really genuine way of showing why that is sound, and or with the equivalent argument, I just found it helpful to go through the light argument in order to explain the sound one, and show why, you know, a candle flame can be light, a flame, and what are the consequences of saying yes, the flame itself is light, and what do we see when we see a flame? And then you get the wonderful conclusion. Light doesn't travel in straight lines. It doesn't go at whatever the speed of light is. It travels maybe rather slowly and takes its time. And so I wanted to get that. I wanted to get that straightened out, and that's really what my purpose was. The thing about people being, if we didn't sort out the sensory input into bits that we're going to attend to and other bits that we're going to suppress, and that brings in the politics, as you say. Well, why do we suppress some things and not others, and what if we did it the other way around? What has struck me is particularly some of the literature on autism, where the thing about an autistic person is not, as some of the cognitive psychologists who pretend to be experts on these things say, oh, autistics are lacking something in their head, so they can't relate to the world properly, and they're stuck inside their shells, and we need to bring them out. We know that the problem is actually quite the reverse, that autistic people are hypersensitive, so that sounds that we can readily dismiss from our minds and let's not bother with can really press on the senses to the extent of being unbearable. And you know, what we perceive as an autistic person going inside themselves is simply like the equivalent of putting your hands on your ears because it sounds so loud. And I've been very much influenced on this by the writings of Erin Manning, which I admire very much, and she's been working with autistic things. And I'm pointing out that, I mean, we are all autistic to a degree, and rather than treating the autistic person as somebody who's got a problem, as somebody who's sort of out, I think we should recognise that they can reveal something that's very important to us. That we're all, to some extent, autistic to a degree, and the problem is precisely how quickly we are shutting things down and moving from the sense of everything being a bit at sea to say, oh, I know what you are. So that we quickly shift through this moment when we hear something, hear a sound, we're not quite sure. We very quickly shift through that period of radical uncertainty to a moment of recognition. We categorize it and say, okay, that's sorted, we know what the world is. And Manning's argument is that this transition, which for most of us is very quick, for an autistic person is drawn out. They linger in that field of uncertainty.
That's what Keats asks people to do.
Yeah, exactly. So so what they're doing is opening up that poetic sensibility that most of us, because of our training or whatever, very, very rapidly close down. And for that reason, and this gets onto the third point, I've never been comfortable with a semiotic approach to the idea that what people are doing is sending information, and then the recipient then has in some way or other to filter. I'm much more inclined, I don't know why, but I just am, to a sense of direct perception, that rather than perception that is always mediated by sounds. And I think that's where the big argument is about. And it's a reason why I was attracted all along to work with people like Gibson, who are arguing, yes, direction is, but it's not that it's all direct, but it can be, as against the semioticians, going back to von Riesco, Peirce and the rest of them, who are always saying that everything is indirect. And so there's probably, in between the lines of what I presented here, is an argument for direct perception over, as against indirect one. And the classic example of the indexical sign in Perth, the smoke and the fire, is actually one-for-one good example, which is relevant to what I'm saying here, because the reason why I don't think it works is this, the classic example is you see smoke, and that's a sign of fire. The sign is indexical because the smoke is directly produced by the fire. You don't see the fire itself. And I say, where the hell does fire end and smoke begin? And you've got here a process of combustion, stuff's going up into the atmosphere, and there's all this smoke.
But that's a question about language.
Well,
We need a word for fire and a word for smoke.
yes, but
Of course, you don't know where one.
no, you don't. And therefore one is not. But Percy is not talking about language. He's talking about perception, and so basically you perceive the fire. If I see some smoke, I can call it. I see smoke. I can just as well say, Christ, I think there's a fire over there. Because what you're perceiving is that something's alight, and a light. The word light is right in there. So I want to. I worry about the semiotic, the view that all life is lived on this, or that we and along with other creatures are suspended in this world of science. Because I feel it somehow lifts off the sign from the media of our direct material life, engagement in the world. I've never felt comfortable with it for that reason. But I'm waiting for somebody to do a study to show, because I can't do it, whether people like Gibson with his theory of direct perception and people like Peirce with his semiotic theory, whether they're actually saying different things, or whether they're really saying exactly the same thing, they're using a different vocabulary to say it. It's probably a bit of both.
I suspect Wendy Wheeler might be helpful in that regard. A colleague of ours, she's been the sort of, I suppose, major conduit for biosemiotics into kind of environmental and agricultural studies. And I think that she would probably argue that latter point, actually, the way that she reads Peirce from Oxford and so on.
And of course you can read them in many different ways.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But I don't have a firm position either way because I can't figure it out.
Yeah, interesting. We have a question.
Hi, thanks for a brilliant talk. Of course, with direct perception, the world does the seeing, us in the world rather than us seeing the world. But there is an anthropocentrism within Gibson, and of course Merleau-Ponty, and a lot of the other examples you use, which differ slightly from the earlier part of your talk, with a certain becoming with the world, out of a pre-individuated nonsense. How, in addressing these more anthropocentric theorists, do you negotiate?
That's a big one. Actually, I think it would be unfair to accuse Gibson of being anthropocentric. He was all the time insisting that he was talking about organisms, and he didn't really care whether they were human or not. But it's interesting that Merleau-Ponty perhaps was more anthropocentric, and I've been trying, and many others have been trying in their work to produce, David Abram as a case in point, of trying to produce a kind of eco-phenomenology which would draw very heavily on Merleau-Pontian insights without having to say that one's talking about something that is exclusively human. And I think that can be done without too much difficulty, and one can jettison the Heidegger stuff that is impossibly anthropocentric. So I think it's possible to draw on Gibson, Merleau-Ponty, or other sources as well, to produce an eco-phenomenology that is not in itself anthropocentric. But the problem that Gibson landed himself into many problems, but one in particular, shows the difficulty of doing this, which is that at one point he tries to address the problem of imagination and what is the difference, if there is one, and the relation between perception and imagination. I couldn't start telling you now about how he does it, but the fact is that he stalls. He can't come up with a sensible or coherent view of what imagination is. And I've hit on the same problem in my own work, where I've been trying very hard to break down human, non-human distinctions and find a way of talking about perception that doesn't require us to make those divisions. And you can push it and push it and push it until you say, okay, we really don't need this human, non-human distinction at all, we can get rid of it. And then somebody comes along and says, okay, but what are you going to do about imagination? What are you going to do about storytelling? What are you going to do about dreaming? Well, maybe animals tell stories, maybe we don't know for sure, but that's where the real problem comes in, and I've found, trying to tackle it, that having sort of gone right to the brink, saying, okay, we don't need this human, non-human distinction at all, and then finding that I actually do have to pull back and say, well, wait a moment. Humans are humans, and there are things they can do that other animals can't, just as there are things other animals can do that humans can't. And we need to try and figure this out. And I'm still, like many others, I'm working on it. I think it critically comes down to the perception of time and about past and futurity and how those are perceived, felt, experienced. And the whole question that raises is whether other animals do experience past and futurity, and they may well, like elephants, for example, probably do. We don't know. But I think probably there are plenty of animals that don't. But the problem is to get the right topic. I mean, if one's going to talk about human distinctiveness, or what it is that we might have that maybe other animals don't, but we're not sure, we at least have to hit on the right thing. It's no good saying, picking on, well, classically we've always picked on the wrong thing. So, only humans have reason, or something like that. And, picked on some rather curious attribute that most people in the world wouldn't pay much attention to in order to distinguish ourselves from everybody else. So we've got to find the right thing. And I think it does for me come down to the sense that we certainly have, I think, as humans, that our lives are caught in a tension between an imagination that is always shooting off into the distance, shooting ahead of ourselves, and a material engagement, the actual friction of dealing with the stuff in the world, that is always holding us back, and we feel caught in that. And the question for me then would be, is that the case for animals?
Just really quickly, it's in ethology possibly a way around that. If really carefully watching what animals do, how their bodies are, how they move, we will get their stories through that. Like, our cats will look out the window, see birds on the ground, and sometimes they think, oh right, I'm going to go all the way through the house, go out the cat flap and try and catch them. If you think of the complexity of what's going on there, and then also they can articulate their ears, so they can listen to one sound over there, one sound over there. At the same time, they're in the world very differently, sound-wise, to we are.
Yeah.
So just watching really carefully what others do, we can generate other stories.
We might be able to. I mean, I wouldn't rule it out. But it's only ever going to be an approximation. But that doesn't matter, I guess. Whatever we think about other people is only going to be an approximation. So yeah, I think you're right. But what we don't have yet, I suppose, is if you're a researcher in this area, clear protocols as to how you should proceed. I mean, at the moment, what we have is, if you were an ethologist, actually a practicing ethologist, or in the field of animal behaviour studies, or an animal psychologist, and you were doing field research with animals, you were given protocols of what to do and how to collect your data and what to notice and what to record, which wouldn't be what you just said. What you just said would be regarded as folksy and anecdotal. And yet it might be that what you just said contains the germ of what we need to be looking for. So we don't have a, I hate using the word methodology because I think it's the wrong word, but we don't yet have a clear sense of how one would proceed with that kind of investigation in such a way as to give it credibility and persuasiveness.
I wonder whether there's an interesting line of inquiry back into Goethe's work, and what you were saying, and that idea of close attention to the living being, but he theorised that there's actually a spiritual transfer between the animal or the
You become a bit...
and in a person, and that you had to bring your imagination, your intuition, as well as your logic to the study of the living. And then you are, again, it's quite...
Yeah, I know, I think you're right. There have been very, very, very big issues here. I'm just writing a little piece at the moment, a little essay about the meaning of research and how it's been corrupted, and I want to say that research is not about objectivity, but about the pursuit of truth. And then you get into really big, well, okay, what is truth? And I've got my definition of truth, which I'm quite proud of, and that is this: it's got nothing to do with objective fact, that the truth is, would come straight out of Goethe, that it's the unison of imagination and experience in a world to which you are alive and that is alive to you. And that is, Goethe, you say you spend a lot of time with a plant, and after a while you almost feel you're beginning to see the world in the same way as the plant does, and you're becoming plant, and the plant becoming you, and you're becoming together, and that has implications for the practice of science, for example, that scientists actually do, to some extent, take on something of the characteristics of what they study in their hearts and minds, in their ways of looking, in their gestures. And actually, most scientists would probably agree, practicing scientists. But mainstream institutional science, just look at the way in which mainstream science now treats the work of Goethe, or that there is this movement of Goethean science which is utterly ridiculed by mainstream science, and that's it's a political problem. And how on earth, with an audience like you won't be talking about Goethe and experience, phenomenology and Merleau-Ponty and semiotics, and most mainstream science would take one look at Jakob von Uexküll and say, who's he? What's this got to do with anything? How we begin even to begin to penetrate, even make a mark on the bunker of mainstream institutional science, I don't know. It leads me often to despair. It really does.
It begins with dialogue, and actually we had the Environmental Humanities forum. Was it the last one? It was one before last, I think. Was actually a couple of scientists, in fact, and their team who are sort of evolutionary ethologists and evolutionary archaeologists, basically trying to understand more about human speciation by looking at our close, simian relatives, as well as looking at bones. And the question came up, they're finding lots and lots and lots of sort of different kind of human species now, and they're asked, what's the current sort of thinking on what makes the kind of classification? Oh, this is human, and they said basically it's teeth and the upright gait. It's the only things that they can find actually in those terms that are kind of that say, yeah, this is a homo. The teeth, because the teeth are small, the teeth get smaller, and the upright gait, and these are things.
But there's a funny story about the upright gait, because there was a long time when evolutionary anthropologists would say that, yes, what really distinguishes, we really know we've got Homo sapiens, but you've got what they call the striding gait. And it turned out that this was based on experiments that were done at the end of the 19th century, in which they would take nude men, so they take away all culture, so no clothes, walking on a bare floor in some sort of gymnasium, and then it was the early days of photography, so they would photograph this, and they would tell the men, now walk, and they would photograph it. And these guys were recruited from the Prussian army.
That was seriously striding.
So when you taught them to stride, they did it properly. And from that arose the idea that this is what the unique, the good colonial stride encompasses the world in the place of everything else. So we shouldn't take that too seriously.
No, but the other thing that was really interesting in their research was that they were finding that the chimpanzee communities that are seriously into tool use are walking more upright, because they're walking along with their tools, so they're walking upright. So it's kind of leading to kind of speculation about whether tool use actually contributed to that kind of upright.
Oh, you probably did. Yeah, and there's that sort. I'm not sure where we go with that. Anyway, yeah.
But going back to what we were talking about before, I mean, I think it's also probably important not to muddle up our ontology and our ethics, as Levinas would remind us, too much. And it may be that it's our imagination, possibly ethical sensibility that is not necessarily uniquely human, but it is a human capacity that we actually need to help to rectify the mess that modern industrial society has kind of made to the.
Perhaps it doesn't matter too much. I mean, how much does it matter whether an ethical sensibility, for example, is unique to us or not? I mean, who cares? The main point is that we do something.
Yeah, quite, absolutely, exactly.
Perhaps these are rather perhaps the problem is a rather unimportant question.
Yes.
Have historically been accorded an importance that they don't really deserve, and then you can look and see why, and all sorts of historical reasons why so much importance has been placed on that particular distinction, instead of, for example, the distinction between vertebrates and non-vertebrates, which I think is probably, in terms of the evolution of life, much more important than anything between human and non-human. Single cells and zygote. I mean, there are all sorts of transition points in the overall history of life on the planet that are well understood, and of which the one that we call Humanities is pretty unremarkable, and yet it just happens to have had rather enormous consequences for the planet, so you can't deny those either. But that's another topic.
In the preface to Being Alive, you talk about the importance of cello.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if you wanted to say something about music and the cello.
I'd be very happy.
How you use it.
I'd be very happy to. I don't actually mention the cello in this talk that I gave just now, but in others that are circling around the same topics, I do. And it's very central to me and to the way I think and the way I write, I think. And I've been playing it since I was 12. So it's sort of very much in my system. And I've often found that when I'm having some correspondence with some colleague or someone who's interested in similar things, and we're talking about it on the email or and sometimes you get the sense that this person gets it intuitively. Then it always turns out that they play the cello. There's something about this instrument which does get into one. So another paper that I wrote recently is called Thinking Through the Cello, which is which is also looking at questions of what we mean by sound, about gesture, about lines, and so on. But in relation to this, I think when you play the cello, and you wouldn't feel as if you were a trumpet player or a flautist or some woodwind brass, but for a string player and a cello player in particular, you do have the sense that you're pulling the sound out of your instrument, like treacle, almost, like something that's rather viscous, and you're stretching it out. So when you're bowing down, and you can actually feel the way that this sound, this note, tone, is being pulled out of the resonant cavity of the instrument in a very muscular, visceral, and manual, gestural way. A pianist wouldn't think like that because they're thinking much more digitally. So that if you play the cello, you know every piece as a gestural performance. I mean, there comes a point where you can sort of forget about the notes. You can't remember what the notes are, but you know the gestures, and the piece will come. So if I sit down to play a Bach prelude by heart, I can do that because my body just knows the gestures to make, and it comes out, and I don't have to think, is this a C or is this an A? I have no idea. I'm just playing it. So there's something about the cello that leads one to accord priority to the way in which lines emerge from gestures and movement. And certainly my trying to think about what a line of sound could be comes directly out of that. I'm thinking that when I'm playing the cello, I am not playing a sequence of notes. I'm producing a line of sound. And as notes, and because it's melodic, I'm not going from note to note, but I'm modulating from one line to another. Probably if you were an opera singer or something like that, you would be thinking the same sort of way about how you actually, how you move from one note to another, not as it's notated on the score, in terms of the dot here and the dot here, and a line connecting, but about a movement here and a movement there, and the way they relate. And there's one other thing, since you got me on this, that not long ago I had a wonderful experience of visiting an artist, although he calls himself not an artist but a geographer of thought, called Jaime Rafoyo, based in Barcelona. And he has this extraordinary ability to draw freehand, perfectly straight lines and perfect circles.
I did the workshop.
You did, Ellie knows all about this because we brought him over and did the workshop. But to draw a perfectly straight line, he hadn't started off as a dancer, and to draw a perfectly straight line, you have to get your body posture just so, and everything like that. You're completely aware of your environment all around you, and then it comes. And I realized that he was talking about you have to be conscious about the movement of your arms, the elbow moving sort of bit out, so it goes like this. But if I'm playing my cello and I want to keep the bow at the same place on the string between the fingerboard and the bridge, as you usually do, I realize that I'm, without thinking about it, doing exactly the same thing, except it's this kind of movement. But it also involves that same sense that you're almost dancing, and that it's all based on the sense of having a postural, gestural balance that involves the whole body and pulling the sound out of that. And that gets so deep into one's sensibility, that it affects the way you think, when you like it, it's everywhere. Sometimes without knowing.
That's what Kandinsky did.
Absolutely, yes. absolutely. And there's a very clear link between what Kandinsky says about in point blank claim about